And we're recording. Welcome back, folks. Today I am joined by Matt Majewski, which I just promised. I think I got it pretty close there, but I'm now suddenly full of anxiety that I didn't get that. Matt is the CTO of onboard.com. Matt, you've had a long background of director of engineering, different software roles. Really, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad to be here.
So, Matt, if you don't mind, can you just start off by sharing a little bit overall perspective on QA throughout your career, how it's evolved throughout your career, how your perspective as an engineering leader has maybe changed in QA, and just give me the narrative about kind of your experiences over time.
Sure. So, my tech career kind of started out as a graphic designer slash software developer at a very small company. So at that time, I would say, just getting started, didn't really know about any kind of testing, didn't really know about automation, QA. So I think at that time, it was essentially the, owner of the company was the main person that QAs. And looking back, it's like that was very effective because it's a small team. You just basically make it look good for the owner. He's always there. It makes sense, right? But as you kind of mature in your software career, you start getting education on, okay, there's actual software QA tools, there's actual processes you have to follow. I think that I kind of learned as I went through my career how important it is to get code reviews and how important it was to have QA and, smoke testing and all these things that help basically keep it reliable for the customer. And I think really a big piece of that is, having the bandwidth to do it on your team or not having it. And I think that's where the automation comes in. So I'm really passionate about automating and doing everything during working hours so that the off work hours are smooth and, deployments are smooth. And so that's a little bit of background and just general thoughts on it.
Awesome. Yeah, there's a number of different ways that I actually want to take that. But the first that comes to mind is, what's your current perspective on automation? Is the developers doing all your automation? Is it just unit testing? I know that this is an area that is honestly a little bit threatening to the QA industry right now, because more and more people are saying, well, like, the defined roles aren't really as clear. Like, what's your current perspective on automation, how it fits into the delivery cycle?
Yeah, so we're definitely in a place where we have unit tests, we have automated builds, things like that in the development process, staging environment, making sure it runs, and then we also have collections of API endpoints and things like that we can just run on demand, and then use that to test. But I would say my current role, at Onboard, we've been a company for about 3 years, and early on, we wanted to start right off with, okay, we're going to have an automated process because we've already had experience doing this in the past. Like, it was a tight team that had worked together. So that's a little bit rare for, I would say, a lot of startups when they're kind of just doing things on the fly at the beginning, and it's focused 100% on product, ship, get it out, get the early customers. But I think we were intentional about, let's do it right from the beginning. Let's spend a little bit of extra time getting some automated tests in. And then as time goes on, you start seeing, okay, we built these features. Now we have new people added to our team. They don't know necessarily all the ins and outs of what was built before, right? And I think that's a big part of it, is you have to understand your team and the roles that are on your team to have an effective QA strategy. So I think, we started with like a master QA plan, for the early, product. And over time, it's hard to keep that updated, right? It's like, it goes months, we add features, we're just doing card by card, pull request by pull request QAs, and it's like that works, but it's like, let's organize it better. So I think the automation comes into play once you have a plan, like, what are we testing? what are our goals? And I think for us, the goal is a smooth customer experience. It may sound simple, but it's that, right? We want to do pre-mortem testing so we don't have to do a post-mortem later and tell people, well, this is why this went down, or this is why this feature didn't work. I think so. There's a lot there, I'm sure, to digest, but I think that's really my perspective on it, is like keeping it on, our team kind of accountable to, what we push to production, and making sure that it's smooth.
Yeah. Sketch out that plan for me in some ways, because one of the interesting things that I find working with leadership teams is that, particularly in the world of technology, and there's certainly exceptions, so I don't want to paint everyone in the broad brush, but oftentimes the QA plan is significantly more simple than maybe your architecture decisions and all these other kind of development plans. And the reality of QA is that it's this really complex, deep world, and one that looks, for a CTO in a startup, what's enough versus what's too much when you start to think about these plans.
Absolutely. I think that's a big part, is understanding how far are we going to take the testing, right? I think the unit tests are really good for things that are like, string formatting, making sure there's validation on endpoints, simple things that that you're developing for, and you already have like security testing built in. And then past that, you still need those regression tests and actually using the product, because we've seen it time and time again in the past where it's like, yeah, all the unit tests are passing, but there's also this other, setting that wasn't in that unit test, and now that page is displaying something that's not, expected. Even though we had a snapshot test, we had an interface, it said it was fine, but once you get to production, it's like, okay, do we need a person to go through this entire plan? And I think, ideally, yes, but in reality, we don't have time to do that. Like, we can't, as our product grows, we can't have one of our developers spending 3 hours for every pull request going through it. So that said, I think it's also the automation part of it. It's not just the code and making sure the functionality works correctly either. I think that's one part. The second part is, does it actually fulfill the UX requirements, and does it actually help bring value to the customer? So I think that's something that I think software developers don't necessarily naturally think about. They're just thinking about, does my code work? Does it run? Is anything broken? There's no errors. There's no security issues. But on top of that is it usable? Does this interface make sense? So I think that role typically falls on, in our team, it's the founders, it's our customers, right? So if you have a close relationship with your customers, that's great. And if your founders are always, looking at the product, that's great. But as you grow, I think that's something that you want a dedicated role for.
Yeah.
But in a small team, you kind of have to use tools to kind of backfill that role, because you're not going to be able to have a budget at the beginning to build out a huge QA team or a product team necessarily, that just focuses on, UX and that. So.
Yeah, it's interesting listening to that, because I do think that a lot of product people sort of create these utopian designs, which are great, right? But then they hand them off to the developers, and then the developers develop against this utopian view of the world. And then you have QA who's kind of like, well, what happens if you light it on fire? And you have all these unanswered questions. I think the word ideally stood out to me there, because I think that's a word that in the world of QA I hear a lot. Something that's interesting is listening to your perspective of 9 to 5 and making sure that you're trying to get everything you need to do in 9 to 5. And my perspective on QA is oftentimes that it's chronically under-resourced. And so you have this world of not not just trade-offs, but honestly just brute force work sometimes. And how have you dealt with that as you've dealt with QA? You know, the times where you have to do 15 hours of regression testing. Do you have any rules of thumb? Are you like somebody who says, hey, for every 5 engineers, it's 1 QA? Or how do you know when's kind of the appropriate amount of resource for QA in your world?
Yeah, I think for us right now, you know, we're a much smaller team. In the past, what we did was we had a QA tool that had pre-written tests. You know, we had real testers working on it or bots. We used a few different QA platforms. Those would run periodically. And then we would also have, you know, a system in place where, you know, we obviously would have, you know, like pager duty or like something to, you know, notify whoever's on call that, hey, something's wrong, we need to check this out. And then also in addition to that, we would have, you know, all the normal tools like error checking, like a Sentry or, you know, all these different tools. So I think in my role, it's how do you manage the amount of tools you have and the amount of people you have, and what's the balance between that? I think typically it's like, okay, we have 4 developers. It's like, we're not going to give one of those developers just a QA role. I typically will spread it out and say QA is everyone's job. Yeah. So when you do a code review, we require code reviews. You know, that's part of the QA process. And we have, you know, automated checklists, and we have the automated tests running. So to me, it's really everybody's job, but specifically, it's the role of the developers to get it to review, QA it themselves, and then once we launch a feature, then it goes to the product team.
Okay.
To QA as well. And that said, I think, you know, it really depends on your team structure. Because I've been in situations too where it's, you know, you've got a product team and they're working in the same room as engineers. So there's that constant communication. It's not just a handoff and then a month later we bring it back. It's constant communication. So I think that's super important if you can do that. If you have a bigger team and that's not possible, I think it's just on, you know, the design side of it, finding a good balance between how much spec are we going to do, how much, you know, development are we going to do in terms of like agile development, you know, are we just making it up as we go along? And I think we've seen like the maturity of product teams and what that can do when you have a bigger team. So it's like, yeah. How do we manipulate and kind of mimic that big company, big, you know, ideal state, but make it smaller and make sure we're covering each area. So I think for me, it's just making sure that you have good tools in place, good people, and that you're communicating the expectations up front.
Yeah, so if budget wasn't a problem, right? And this is a very utopian question, so apologies. Like, walk me through QA for the next couple of years at Onboard. Is it something where you guys have ephemeral environments and you're running automation in ephemeral environments? Are you doing database seeding? Are you guys doing some manual testing, no manual testing? Walk me through, do you have a director of QA of sort of kind of when? Like, have you sketched that out for yourself in your mind, knowing full well that some of this obviously is resource constraints and stuff like that, but I'm just curious to know where you would see it going.
Absolutely. Yeah. In an ideal world, we would have multiple staging environments, and one of them would be just for QA, right? And then we would have it automatically seeding and automatic, you know, set up, tear down for each QA test to keep the data small. And then we would also have an automated platform to do that. You know, I won't like give names, but I think there's a lot out there that are, you know, really good. And I think, you know, having that automated tool run whenever something's pushed to the QA environment, and then running smoke tests periodically, against those same tests, primarily on the interface, actually using the product, going through, clicking, verifying the data, going through all the pages, all the features, going through any edge cases that we've written for. And then as well, just seeing, making sure that we have the other tools in place to make sure that we're getting notified if there's anything wrong in production, and making sure that goes to the right teams. So I think, all those things are important. And then on top of that, for compliance, SOC 2, ISO, just making sure that we're dealing with any incidents that we have as well. Mm-hmm. I know we didn't really define fully what QA encompasses necessarily, but I think it's it can result in downtime if you don't QA right. It can result in more bugs, more errors, more customer tickets, things like that. So it's how do we make sure that all of that is funneled to the right place, and that we're keeping on top of those things as we go.
Yeah, and it's interesting just listening to you talk about that and the range of it, right? Because then I'm picturing the one QA in a startup, and they're like, do QA, right? And you're like, oh, where do you even start? Something that comes to mind that I want to ask about is, do you feel like if I'm a QA person and I'm kind of thinking about where I want to go, a natural parallel for me is to learn more on the DevOps side, because it feels like there's a lot of opportunity to grow, not just in your sort of traditional DevOps, but helping organizations think about ephemeral environments, helping organizations thinking about testing even their Kubernetes clusters and stuff like that, and bringing more of a QA mindset to that world. Would you encourage that kind of thinking for a QA person, or is there other paths that you think hey, maybe that's two very different sets of skills? I'm just curious to know where you would tell sort of a QA person looking to grow where they should be focused on.
Yeah, so I would say if you're a QA engineer and you're primarily dealing with developers, I think it's important to have some technical background. It's not, you don't need to know the ins and outs of Kubernetes necessarily, but I think you should try to find some people in your organization that can help you understand it or answer questions. Because I think a lot of times there's a disconnect between the QA engineer and the developers and the product team. And I think it's really important for them to be on the same page and to understand the challenges of, okay, the developer created it this way for a reason, and the product team wanted it to be this way. The QA tester is telling them this isn't meeting the requirements, and the product team is like, oh, that's okay. We already talked about that, right? So I think on the technical side, yeah, I think it's important to know, some scripting languages, at least a little bit, just to help you with your job, and I think also it depends on, are you a Selenium tester? Is it expected in your role that you are actually programming tests at a low level, or are you clicking through? Are you just on the interface, and do you have eye tracking? Do you have what kind of environment are you testing for? So I think on the dev side, I think it's important. I think if you're just talking about usability, I think it's almost more important that you don't know the details, because you want to mimic what your customer is going to experience. They have no idea about Kubernetes. They don't care if you're using Node. They don't care if you're using React or the challenges that come with that and state management. So I think it's important to have that perspective as a QA person, putting yourself in the customer's shoes. So in some ways, I know this is probably controversial, but I think in some ways it's better not to have that background, because you see it time and time again where developers, we're biased, right?
You create a confirmation bias, right, in some ways. And I actually agree with that. I don't think it's that controversial at all, but maybe I have even more of a controversial opinion where I think most people are wrong in how they think people are going to use their apps. And I think that the best QA have the ability to sort of figure that out in some ways. And then there's also an emotional intelligence piece about QA that is really overlooked, which is like, we're in a state of constant conflict. We're telling product people about certain flaws in their design and saying, well, what happens if you do this? What happens if you do this? And they're saying, well, no one's ever going to do that. It's like, okay, we can talk about that. Or developers saying like, this is done. You're like, well, it's not really. And it was interesting listening to you talk about that because it's such a balance of the tool sets and thinking about like, there's so many tool sets that are fairly technical in nature to deploy that QA are like, this would be so helpful, but they can't get movement in their organization to even like put it in place. And then also just like the conflict nature of it. And not to sound like QA is the victim of everything around them, but it's interesting thinking about like their ability to deploy some of that. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
So in the last couple minutes here, and I know I'm trying to keep these around 20 minutes, so we're kind of right towards the end. What kind of final thoughts do you have towards QA of the industry, being a CTO, specifically thinking about why would you get into QA? Should you get into QA? I'm genuinely honest, your kind of honest perspective on this industry, the state of this industry, thinking about both prospective people and why they should consider QA, as well as anybody who's right now in it. You know, what would be your overall advice?
I say this to everybody, keep learning, keep researching the tools that are available to you, because I think it's easy to get stuck on like, I need to learn this one tool and then I'll get a job in QA using that one tool. I think your resourcefulness is going to be the number one trait because it's a constantly changing world environment. So I think as a QA engineer or a usability tester, get those concepts in place, learn the patterns, and also just listen to, customers and listen and watch. If you can get any data or any screenshots, or even better, getting like actual user data through, watching them on a screen, like there's, screen recording tools and product analytics tools, like things like that. I think that's really going to help. And I think also like as a person that's ahead, always asking for QA, and I'm usually the one that's the final QA person. There's a lot of pressure on the QA, right? And it's like, you're in a place where it's like, you're kind of giving the sign off, but don't put too much pressure on yourself because it's a team effort. It really is. It's not the QA person's fault if something goes out and there's an issue with it necessarily. Especially when it comes to usability, it's the entire team's responsibility to communicate. Like, let's design it well from the beginning. Make sure that we're communicating those requirements through the process. And then also just, making sure that we're up and running, and that if you do have an issue, like you're handling them right away with customers, especially early on.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll end saying thank you for that perspective, because it's wild the number of times that if a bug reaches production, it's like it's the QA's fault. And that is true, right? In some ways, right? We all are a team and we're doing our job. And if it's something that was a test and for whatever, but it's also wild to think about, like, we're also not the cause of the bug per se. And I'm not trying to shift the blame by any means, but that holistic view of it versus sort of just like, why did this? And I get that that's part of our job, but I'll say I appreciate that perspective and thank you. Matt, thank you so much for joining. I probably could keep asking questions for another 20 minutes, but I'm trying to keep these somewhat more listenable in that sense. So I really appreciate your perspective and time. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks, guys. We'll talk soon.